If you hear someone calling your name in the Appalachian Mountains late at night, do not look back. Do not answer. And above all, do not step off the trail to follow that voice, because the thing calling out to you in those ancient dark woods is using a voice it stole. It is waiting in the thick fog, listening to your every breath, learning how to sound like the people you trust most. And once it knows your name, it will never stop calling for you. The Appalachian Mountains are among the oldest mountains on the face of the earth. They are older than the Atlantic Ocean. They are older than bones, older than trees, and older than human memory itself. Stretching over 2,000 miles from the deep southern ridges of Georgia all the way to the rugged wilderness of Maine, the Appalachian Trail is celebrated as the ultimate escape for backpackers seeking solitude. To millions of tourists, it is a place of breathtaking natural beauty. But locals who have lived in the shadows of these ancient ridge lines for generations know a far darker, unwritten truth. Deep within these vast, untouched forests, there are places where the canopy grows so dense that sunlight barely touches the forest floor. There are hollows where sound dies, where compasses spin aimlessly, and where ancient things still stalk the night. The mountain folk have simple, strict rules passed down through centuries. If you see something in the trees, know you didn't. If you hear your name called from the dark, keep walking, and whatever you do, never look back. Tonight, we open our first chapter into the unsettling encounters documented along this legendary trail. Our first story comes from a seasoned hiker named Mark. Back in the summer of 2021, Mark and his longtime backpacking partner Alex set out to tackle a challenging 60-mile section of the Great Smoky Mountains. Both men were experienced outdoorsmen in their early 30s. They had spent years navigating rugged terrain, surviving sudden mountain storms, and pitching camp in isolated backcountry areas. To them, this trip was meant to be routine, a grueling but satisfying week away from the noise of modern life. By the third afternoon, they had pushed deep into the wilderness, miles away from any paved road, ranger station, or cell service. The trail had led them high onto an isolated ridge surrounded by dense hemlock trees and thick beds of mountain laurel. As late afternoon set in, the summer heat gave way to a sudden, dramatic drop in temperature. A heavy, suffocating fog rolled up from the valley below, spilling across the ridge like thick gray smoke. Within 30 minutes, visibility dropped to barely 15 feet in front of them. Navigating in the dark fog was becoming dangerous. Exhausted, soaked with sweat and cold moisture, Mark and Alex decided to cut their hiking day short. They found a small, semi-flat clearing slightly off the main trail, tucked between two massive ancient oak trees. They quickly pitched their two-person nylon tent, ate a cold dinner from their packs, and crawled into their sleeping bags. By 9 o'clock, the woods were enveloped in pitch blackness, and both men fell into a deep, heavy sleep. Around 2:15 in the morning, Mark suddenly snapped awake. He lay completely still in the dark, his eyes wide open, staring up at the roof of the tent. It was not a bad dream that had woken him. It was not the biting cold air, nor was it the discomfort of the hard ground beneath his pad. It was the sudden, absolute silence outside. If you have ever spent a night in the deep woods, you know that the forest is never truly quiet. Even in the dead of night, there is a constant, ambient symphony of nature. The wind rustling through the upper canopy, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, or the gentle rustle of small animals moving through the dry leaves. But right now, there was nothing. It was a complete, suffocating vacuum of sound. No wind, no insects, no movement. It felt as if the entire forest had held its breath, frozen in collective terror. Mark lay paralyzed, listening to the loud rhythmic pounding of his own heart against his ribs. Every muscle in his body was tense, reacting to an instinctual alarm bell ringing deep within his brain. And then, from somewhere out in the fog, about 30 yards behind their tent, a voice echoed through the silence. "Mark? Hey, Mark! Come out here for a second. Look at this." Mark blinked into the darkness, his brow furrowing in confusion. The voice sounded distinctly familiar. It had the exact same pitch, the exact same casual tone, and the same slight southern drawl as his hiking partner Alex. Mark assumed Alex had woken up in the middle of the night to step outside and use the bathroom, perhaps stumbling across an interesting piece of wildlife or a strange landmark in the fog. Grumbling softly under his breath, Mark reached down to grab his headlamp from his jacket pocket. He prepared to unzipper the front flap of the tent to tell his friend to shut up and get back inside. He turned around on his sleeping pad, pointing his unlit headlamp toward the entrance. And that was the exact moment his blood ran cold. Right beside him, wrapped tightly in a blue sleeping bag, was Alex. He was lying on his side, his face barely 2 feet away from Mark's, fast asleep and breathing heavily. Mark stared at his sleeping friend in absolute horror. A wave of ice-cold adrenaline flooded his veins. His mind raced, frantically trying to process what his eyes were seeing. If Alex was right here inside the tent, fast asleep, whose voice had just called out his name from the pitch-black woods outside? Before Mark could process the terror gripping his chest, he heard the sound of footsteps. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Heavy, deliberate footsteps were moving through the wet leaves outside, coming from the direction where the voice had just called out. Whatever was out there was walking slowly, deliberately approaching the rear of their tent. Mark held his breath, unable to move a single muscle. The footsteps stopped less than 3 feet away from the thin nylon wall right behind his head. For several agonizing seconds, there was only silence. Then, Mark heard a sound that made his stomach turn. It was a wet, heavy, rasping sound, like something trying to draw air through a set of hollow, malformed lungs. It was standing right outside, separated from Mark by nothing more than a fraction of an inch of thin, water-resistant fabric. And then, the voice spoke again. But this time, something was horribly wrong. "Mark! Hey, Mark, come out here. Look at this." It was repeating the exact same sentence, word for word, syllable for syllable. But the inflection was completely wrong. It was flat, artificial, and devoid of any human emotion. It sounded like a corrupted audio recording being played back through a broken speaker, an imitation of Alex's voice created by something that didn't understand how human speech actually worked. Suddenly, the nylon fabric near the top of the tent wall stretched inward. Mark watched in sheer terror as the shape of long, impossibly thin fingers pressed against the outside of the tent, outlining themselves against the dark fabric. The fingers were far too long to belong to a human hand, ending in blunt, jointless tips. Terror seized Mark's throat, choking back any chance of a scream. Acting purely on survival instinct, he reached out with a trembling hand, placed his palm firmly over Alex's mouth, and violently shook his sleeping partner by the shoulder. Alex jolted awake, his eyes wide with confusion and irritation. But before Alex could utter a sound, Mark leaned in close, his eyes wide with terror, and pressed a finger to his lips. He pointed with a shaking hand toward the rear wall of the tent. Alex looked at the stretched nylon, seeing the outline of the elongated fingers pressing into their sleeping space. All the color drained from Alex's face. And then, the entity outside leaned closer to the tent wall. The artificial voice spoke one final time, but this time, it did not sound like Alex at all. The voice dropped several octaves into a deep, guttural, hollow rasp that vibrated straight through the ground beneath their bodies. "I know you are awake, Mark." The moment those words were spoken, the entity did not turn and walk away. It sprinted into the thick brush at an impossible speed. The sound of heavy, powerful impacts echoed through the dark as it crashed through the forest, snapping thick oak branches like wooden matchsticks as it tore up the steep ridgeline, until the sounds of its movement finally faded into the distant foggy silence. Mark and Alex did not sleep for the rest of the night. They sat side by side in the center of the tent, clutching their knives, staring at the walls until the first pale gray light of dawn broke through the heavy fog. The moment it was light enough to see, they abandoned half of their heavy camping gear, packed only their essentials, and hiked 12 relentless miles back to the trailhead without stopping a single time. Mark never returned to the Appalachian Trail, and to this day, he still wakes up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, staring into the dark corner of his bedroom, wondering whose voice that thing was using before it learned his name. Our second story was submitted directly to us by a former National Park Service ranger who spent nearly 15 years working along the rugged Shenandoah portion of the Appalachian Trail. For professional reasons, and out of respect for the missing person's family, he requested to remain anonymous. It was late September of 2018. The summer crowds had mostly cleared out, leaving the high ridges quiet as the autumn leaves began their slow transition into vibrant shades of red and gold. During this time of year, rangers often deal with minor injuries or lost hikers who miscalculate the shortening daylight hours. But what started as a routine welfare check quickly turned into one of the most disturbing open cases in the park's history. A 32-year-old solo hiker named Jonathan had been reported overdue by his family. Jonathan was not an amateur. He was a meticulous, highly experienced woodsman who had completed several long-distance treks across North America. He always carried proper safety equipment, left detailed paper itineraries with his relatives, and checked in via satellite messenger at designated checkpoints. When 48 hours passed without a word from Jonathan after his expected exit date, a small search and rescue team was mobilized. Led by our ranger, a squad of 4 experienced trackers set out from the nearest trailhead, following the route Jonathan had mapped out along a secluded 16-mile stretch of the trail. On the second afternoon of the search, the team broke off the main path to investigate a dense, unmaintained ravine known locally as Devil's Hollow. It was an area characterized by steep limestone outcroppings, thick thickets of mountain laurel, and ancient timber that blocked out most of the ski. At roughly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, one of the searchers called out over the radio. He had found Jonathan's campsite tucked deep inside the hollow, nearly 200 yards away from the official trail. As the ranger approached the scene, his first impression was one of utter confusion. At initial glance, everything looked completely normal, almost unnaturally pristine. Jonathan's heavy-duty dome tent was pitched properly on flat ground, secured firmly to the earth with aluminum stakes. The rainfly was pulled tight, and a small campfire pit sat nearby containing cold gray ashes from 2 nights prior. But as the team stepped closer to inspect the campsite, the details began to turn deeply unsettling. The front door of the tent was wide open, flapping gently in the cold mountain breeze. Inside, Jonathan's massive internal frame backpack sat leaning neatly against the rear wall, fully packed with his sleeping pad, camping stove, and extra rations. His leather wallet, satellite communicator, and car keys were sitting in a neat pile right on top of his folded sleeping bag. Most terrifying of all were his hiking boots. They were sitting neatly aligned right beside the open entrance of the tent. They were untied, but completely dry and undamaged. In the world of wilderness search and rescue, rangers learn to read a campsite like a book. If a hiker leaves their tent voluntarily in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, they put on their boots. If they are surprised and dragged out of their tent by a large predator, such as a black bear or a mountain lion, there are unmistakable, violent signs of a struggle. There would be shredded fabric, bent tent poles, scattered equipment, and blood trails on the dirt. Here, there was nothing. No torn fabric, no bent poles, no signs of any struggle whatsoever. It was as if Jonathan had simply dissolved into thin air directly from inside his tent, leaving all of his worldly possessions neatly arranged behind him. Puzzled and growing increasingly uneasy, the ranger decided to expand the search grid on foot, looking for any subtle disturbance in the surrounding forest floor. 50 yards south of the campsite, Near the base of a massive, hollowed-out oak tree, he spotted something catching the faint sunlight. It was Jonathan's smartphone. It was lying face up on a thick bed of dry pine needles. The glass screen was spider-webbed with cracks, as if it had been dropped from a height, but when the ranger picked it up and pressed the power button, the display flickered to life. The battery was sitting at a mere 3%. The ranger bypassed the lock screen and opened the phone's native camera application to check the video gallery, hoping to find a trail log or a clue regarding Jonathan's location. There was a single 42-second video file saved to the memory. It had been recorded at precisely 3:14 in the morning, 2 nights before the search team arrived. The ranger put on a pair of rubber gloves, held the screen close, and hit play. The video was pitch black at first. The only sound echoing through the phone's tiny speaker was the heavy, frantic breathing of a man trying desperately to remain quiet. After a few seconds, the phone's bright LED flashlight flickered on, illuminating the yellow nylon ceiling of Jonathan's tent from the inside. The camera trembled violently in Jonathan's hand. When he spoke, his voice was nothing more than a raspy, terrified whisper. He said, "It has been sitting outside my tent for 3 hours. It is not moving. It is not making a sound. But every time I reach out to touch the zipper, it moves its hand to the door." In the video, Jonathan slowly turned the shaking camera lens toward the bottom zipper of the tent entrance. And there, pressed firmly against the fine mesh screen of the tent door, illuminated by the harsh white beam of the flashlight, was a dark, elongated silhouette. It was the distinct shape of a hand. It had 5 fingers, but the proportions were utterly inhuman. The digits were impossibly thin, stretching nearly 12 inches long, ending in blunt, smooth tips that lacked any fingernails. The hand was holding the fabric flat against the frame, pinned from the outside. In the recording, Jonathan let out a soft, sobbing gasp. Driven by pure, unadulterated panic, he reached out his left hand, grabbed the metal zipper pull, and dragged it open by barely 2 inches to see what was standing on the other side. The second the zipper clicked open, a sound echoed through the recording that the ranger later said would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. It was not a bear's growl. It was not the scream of a mountain lion. It was a high-pitched, metallic screech, like 2 rusty sheets of heavy steel sliding against each other at blinding speed. The camera violently dropped face first onto the floor of the tent. There was a chaotic flurry of rustling fabric, a sickening tearing sound, and then absolute dead silence. The video cut to black as the recording ended. The ranger immediately radioed the state police and handed the phone over to the lead investigator. Over the next 2 weeks, an exhaustive search operation involving tracking hounds, thermal imaging drones, and dozens of ground volunteers combed every inch of Devil's Hollow and the surrounding ridges. They found nothing. No clothing, no footprints, and no human remains were ever recovered. The official National Park Service report eventually listed Jonathan's case as an unfortunate disappearance due to getting lost and succumbing to environmental exposure. But the ranger knew what he saw on that video screen. 3 months after the investigation was officially closed, he handed in his badge and resigned from the service. He never set foot in the Appalachian wilderness again, unable to shake the terrifying realization that in those vast ancient forests, humanity is not at the top of the food chain. Our final story takes us to the remote border region between Tennessee and North Carolina, a stretch of the Appalachian Trail infamous for its treacherous ridgelines, sudden microburst storms, and vast, untouched wilderness. It was mid-July, and a young couple, David and Sarah, were 3 days into a planned week-long backpacking trek. Both in their late 20s, they had spent months preparing for the trip, looking forward to unplugging from their busy city lives. What had started as a warm, clear summer morning quickly turned hostile by late afternoon. Dark, bruised storm clouds rolled over the mountain ridge at alarming speed, bringing with them a blinding tropical downpour, fierce gusts of wind, and blinding sheets of lightning. Desperate to escape the deluge, David pulled out their waterlogged paper map, shielding it with his coat. He noticed a faint handwritten marking indicating a small emergency trail shelter half a mile off the main path, down an overgrown side trail. Pushing through the pounding rain, with visibility dropping to near zero and thunder booming directly overhead, they stumbled down the muddy path until the dark silhouette of a small structure materialized out of the gray mist. It was not a standard wooden three-sided shelter commonly found along the trail. It was an old abandoned stone cabin built nearly a century ago by early settlers or logging crews. Its thick walls were constructed from heavy field stones, and its entrance was fitted with a thick hand-hewn oak door hanging on heavy, rusted iron hinges. Grateful beyond words to find solid shelter from the roaring elements, David pushed the heavy wooden door open, and they stepped inside. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and old pine, but the stone roof was solid and dry. The tiny cabin was completely empty, save for a stone fireplace filled with old dirt and a small wooden bench against the far wall. To keep the howling mountain wind from blowing the door open during the night, David found a heavy 3-foot oak log sitting near the hearth and propped it securely against the base of the heavy wooden door. They stripped off their soaked jackets, set up their sleeping bags directly on the floor, and lit a small propane camping stove to warm up. By midnight, the summer storm reached a terrifying peak. Tremendous cracks of thunder shook the stone foundation of the cabin, and lightning flashed through the narrow gaps in the stonework. Sarah had managed to fall into an exhausted sleep, but David lay wide awake, watching the flickering shadows on the ceiling. That was when he heard a noise that did not belong to the storm. 3 heavy rhythmic thuds echoed through the small stone room. Knock, knock, knock. Slow, deliberate knocking on the heavy wooden door. David froze. Every nerve in his body went dead quiet. He stared at the thick oak door in disbelief. Who on earth could be standing on a remote mountain trail at midnight in the middle of a violent, flooding thunderstorm? He waited, holding his breath, desperately praying that the sound had merely been a fallen branch scraping against the stone. But 5 seconds later, the knocking returned. Harder this time. Knock, knock, knock. David slowly stood up, reaching down to grab his heavy fixed-blade hunting knife from his pack. He crept toward the door, placed his ear near the damp wood, and called out into the roaring wind. "Who is there? Do you need help?" There was no human response, only the sound of rain slamming against the oak planks. David stood there, his hands shaking around the hilt of his knife. Suddenly, the heavy log propped against the base of the door shifted slightly against the stone floor. Something on the outside was pushing inward against the heavy wood, testing its weight and resistance. David took a sharp step back, his heart hammering in his throat. "I am armed. State your name." Instead of a voice, David heard a sound that made his skin crawl. It was a wet, sharp scratching noise, like long metal nails dragging across raw stone. The sound began at the front door, dragged slowly along the exterior stone wall to the left, and moved around the perimeter of the cabin. It stopped directly outside a tiny square window, cut high into the side wall. The window was located about 6 feet off the ground, lacking glass and covered only by a thick wooden shutter held shut from the inside by a simple iron latch. David swung his flashlight beam toward the window. The wooden shutter was vibrating softly. Something on the outside was gently running long fingernails up and down the exterior wooden slats. And then, Right before David's eyes, the iron latch on the inside began to slowly, methodically slide open. Panic surged through David's chest. He dropped his flashlight, lunged forward, and threw his entire body weight against the wooden shutter, jamming his hunting knife straight into the gap above the latch to lock the mechanism in place. The moment the knife wedged into the wood, something slammed against the outside of the shutter with tremendous, bone-shattering force. The iron hinges groaned, and stone dust rained down from the ceiling. David screamed at the top of his lungs for Sarah to wake up. For 15 agonizing minutes, the entity conducted a violent, methodical siege of the cabin. It slammed against the wooden shutter, circled the stone walls, and pounded on the heavy oak door. Throughout the attack, it emitted low, rhythmic whistles that mimicked the sound of the wind, but the pitch was structured, intentional, and mocking. And then, just as suddenly as the nightmare had begun, the torrential rain stopped. The wind died down to a dead calm. Directly above David's head, a low, wet, gurgling sound echoed from the roof shingles. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and unhurried, crept across the roof of the cabin, moved toward the rear of the building, and dropped with a heavy thud into the soft mud behind the structure. Then, absolute silence reclaimed the forest. David and Sarah remained wedged against the window and door until the morning sun fully illuminated the surrounding trees. They did not speak a single word. When they finally summoned the courage to step outside, they found deep, unnatural impressions in the thick mud surrounding the cabin. They were not boots, and they were not animal paws. They were deep, elongated gouges, as if something massive had been walking on long, narrow stilts. And on the exterior of the wooden shutter where David had held his ground, 5 deep parallel claw marks were carved clean into the hard oak wood, inches deep into the timber. They packed their essential gear and sprinted the 4 miles back to the nearest road, leaving their tent and camping stove behind in the cabin. They never set foot in the wilderness again. The Appalachian Mountains hold secrets that defy modern explanation. Whether it is mimicked voices echoing through the fog, unexplained disappearances deep within national parks, or unseen horrors circling in the dark, one ancient rule remains absolute. If you venture deep into those woods, respect the quiet. Thank you for listening to tonight's episode of Nightfall Archives. If these stories chilled you, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your own unexplained wilderness encounters in the comments below. Until next time, stay out of the dark.